a watch dial, a small brush with a fine tip, and a bottle containing self-luminous paint that glowed a wondrous blue light in the dark. The lovely young woman skillfully applied the magical paint onto the watch dial using a small brush with a fine tip, and a bottle that glowed a wondrous blue light in the dark. This was a job for over 3,000 girls and young women in the 1920s, who had seized upon a new and unusual work opportunity: painting glow-in-the-dark numerals on the dials of watches, clocks, and military equipment. Their job was to paint dials using a luminous substance called radium, which made the dials glow in the dark. Little did they know that radium was a highly radioactive substance, and their exposure to it would have devastating consequences. Their teeth would fall out, their jaw would shatter into pieces with just a light touch, and their legs would break into pieces when walking, quite literally. Dial painting was a crucial part of the watch and clock-making industry in the 1920s. It involved painting watch and clock dials with a luminous substance that made them glow in the dark. The substance used for this purpose was radium, a highly radioactive element discovered by Marie Curie just less than 20 years prior. The clock hands would emit a wondrous blue light without requiring a charge from the sun. The substance was even rumored to be able to cure all kinds of illnesses. It sounded like magic. The process of dial painting was delicate and required a lot of precision. The young women who worked in the dial painting factories were recruited based on their ability to handle small and delicate tools with precision. Using a tiny brush, the young women would carefully paint the radium mixture onto the dials, making sure to create an even coat. This process required a steady hand and a lot of patience. As the brushes would lose shape after a few strokes, the factory supervisors encouraged their workers to point the brushes with their lips, or use their tongues to keep them sharp. Once the dials were painted, they would be exposed to the light for a short period of time. This would cause the radium to glow, making the dials visible in the dark. The dials were then assembled into watches and clocks, making them highly sought after by consumers who wanted to be able to tell the time in the dark. But little did the young women know that the radium they were working with was highly radioactive, and their exposure to it would have dire consequences. The young women who worked in the dial painting factories in the 1920s were known as the Radium Girls. They were mostly teenagers and young women who were attracted to the well-paying job, and were promised that the radium they worked with was safe. The factory owners claimed that the radium was harmless, and that it would even have health benefits. They encouraged the workers to put radium powder on their skin and nails to make them glow in the dark, and even provided them with small radium bottles to take home. The young women were not aware of the dangers of radium exposure, and believed that their job was safe. They were not provided with any protective gear, and often ingested the radium powder as they painted the dials. In 1922, Molly Maggia, a young dial painter, had to temporarily quit her job due to illness, but she didn't know what was wrong with her. Her troubles began with a toothache, so she went to the dentist to have it pulled out, but then the next tooth started to hurt and suffered the same fate as the previous one. However, the story didn't end there. After losing her tooth, painful sores began to develop and grow like flowers at the site. They bloomed in red and yellow colors and were accompanied by blood and pus. The sores oozed continuously and caused her breath to smell foul. Later, she experienced painful aches in her arms and legs, to the point where she couldn't walk. Her doctor diagnosed her with rheumatism and prescribed aspirin for treatment. In May 1922, Molly was feeling extremely desperate. At that point, she had lost almost all of her teeth and the mysterious infection had spread throughout her body. Her entire lower jaw, palate, and even some of the bones of her ear had formed what doctors described as a large abscess. However, things took a turn for the worse when Molly's dentist gently tapped on her jawbone from inside her mouth. To his horror and astonishment, it shattered under his fingers. He removed it, not by surgery, but by putting his fingers in her mouth and lifting it out. Just a few days later, Molly's entire lower jaw also fell out and was removed in a similar way. Molly Maggia's body was literally falling apart. And she was not the only one. On September 12, 1922, the unusual infection that had plagued her for less than a year had spread to the tissues in her throat. The disease gradually eroded her veins, and at 5 p.m. that day, her mouth filled with blood due to rapid bleeding, leaving her nurses helpless and unable to resist. She eventually passed away at the age of 24. The doctors were confused about the cause of her death. Ironically, they recorded on her death certificate that she died of syphilis. and this death certificate later became something her former company would use against her. Radium was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898. At the time, it was believed to have many potential uses, including as a medical treatment and a glow-in-the-dark paint. In the early 20th century, radium became a popular ingredient in luminous paint used for watches and instrument dials. The Radium Girls, who worked in the dial painting factories, were among the first to discover the dangers of radium. However, the discovery of the dangers of radium was a gradual process that involved many scientists and medical professionals. In the 1920s, a group of scientists led by Alice Hamilton began to investigate the health effects of radium exposure. Their studies revealed that radium was a highly toxic substance that could cause serious health problems, including cancer and bone damage. The symptoms of radiation poisoning can vary depending on the level and duration of exposure. The early symptoms of radiation poisoning include nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. These symptoms can occur within hours or days of exposure and are caused by damage to the gastrointestinal system. As the exposure continues, the symptoms can progress to include weakness, fatigue, and dizziness. This is caused by the damage to blood vessels and the circulatory system. The most serious consequences of radiation poisoning are the development of cancer and damage to the bone marrow. The Radium Girls who were exposed to high levels of radium developed various types of cancer, including bone cancer and leukemia. They also suffered from anemia and bone fractures due to the damage to their bone marrow. This caused significant pain and disability, and many of them were unable to work or live a normal life. The symptoms of radiation poisoning can be difficult to diagnose, as they can be mistaken for other health conditions. In the case of the Radium Girls, their exposure was chronic and long-term. They ingested radium powder as they painted the dials, and the radium particles became embedded in their bones. The effects were devastating. Radiation caused significant damage to their bone marrow. As a dial painter, Grace Fryer had to wear a steel back brace because her spine was crushed. Another girl's jaw was eroded and became shaped like a dried tree stump. The legs of other women also became shorter and broke naturally. But their symptoms were dismissed by their employers and doctors, while the factory owners tried to downplay the severity of the situation, and refused to acknowledge that the young women's health problems were caused by radium exposure. It wasn't until 1925 when Dr. Harrison Martland intervened to exhume the body of Molly Maggia and investigate other similar deaths that the truth was finally proven. Radium was responsible for poisoning these girls. The Radium Girls were not willing to accept this. They started to speak out about their experiences and fought for compensation and justice. Before the trial was reviewed by the jury in the fall of 1928, the case of the Radium Girls was resolved, with each of them receiving a settlement of $10,000, as well as a $600 annual annuity, paid in weekly installments of $12, for their entire lives. Additionally, the company would cover any medical and legal expenses incurred by the girls. Their suffering was not in vain, however. The legacy of the Radium Girls lives on. Their efforts led to the establishment of better working conditions and safety regulations and paved the way for workplace safety standards. Today, there are strict regulations in place to protect workers from exposure to hazardous materials. Following the discovery of the dangers of radium, regulations governing the use of radioactive materials were established, including the creation of agencies such as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. These agencies are responsible for enforcing safety standards in the workplace and ensuring that workers are protected from hazardous materials, including radiation. The legacy of the Radium Girls also includes the development of medical treatments for radiation poisoning. In the 1940s, a treatment using calcium and zinc was developed that could remove radium from the body. This treatment was used to save the lives of workers involved in the Manhattan Project, which developed the first atomic bomb. In honor of the Radium Girls, memorials have been erected in their honor, including a statue in Ottawa, Illinois. Their story will never be forgotten, and their legacy lives on in the continued efforts to ensure workplace safety and the protection of workers' health. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please hit like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.